217 BC. The Levantine coast. Two massive empires. One brutal destiny. 75,000 soldiers. 73 war elephants. The battle that saved Egypt, but destroyed its future. The unforgiving desert sun glared down mercilessly upon the most magnificent military assembly the ancient world had ever witnessed. Two colossal empires prepared to resolve their bitter territorial disputes through an absolute symphony of organized human combat. By the sheer mathematics of traditional ancient warfare, this monumental engagement should have been a glorious Seleucid walkover. The Seleucid Empire possessed the most formidable professional standing army that the known Hellenistic world had ever seen. However, history is rarely decided by simple mathematics when a defending kingdom fights purely for its own survival. Across the shimmering desert dunes, King Ptolemy IV had been preparing precisely for this exact, terrifying nightmare. Facing a rapidly expanding superpower, he did not rely on conventional defense tactics or traditional Greek mercenary forces. Instead, Ptolemy completely transformed his entire wealthy kingdom into a highly secretive and remarkably efficient underground military factory. He deployed a ruthless strategy of cultural integration, fielding a completely unexpected weapon designed to shock the invaders. To the arrogant Seleucid commanders, Ptolemy's defending forces were merely insignificant prey, marching blindly into an inevitable trap. How did a supposedly decadent Egyptian ruler operate a massive logistical network to defeat this perfectly organized invasion? And what terrifying political ingenuity nearly left the invincible Seleucid machine buried forever beneath the burning desert sands? Today, we will walk through the monumental Battle of Raphia, breaking down a brutal masterclass of ancient strategy. We will deeply examine the precise engineering, logistical discipline, and desperate decisions that decided the fate of Egypt. To understand why this devastating clash became entirely inevitable, we must deeply examine the precarious ancient political climate. Following the death of Alexander the Great, his massive global empire splintered into several constantly warring successor states. The Seleucid Empire controlled the vast Eastern Asian territories, while the Ptolemaic dynasty maintained an iron grip over Egypt. For several decades, these two massive superpowers fought bitterly over the Levantine coast, a wealthy region called Coela Syria. Antiochus III was absolutely nothing like the previous passive rulers who sat comfortably inside their luxurious palaces. He was, first and foremost, a visionary military conqueror who understood imperial expansion as intimately as the sword. When he took the Seleucid throne, the previous loss of ancestral Syrian territories was not just a political inconvenience. It was an open wound, a daily reminder broadcast across the empire that Seleucid military dominance was fading. Antiochus systematically reconquered those lost territories, marching his massive veteran army directly toward the highly vulnerable Egyptian borders. From his grand royal palace in Alexandria, King Ptolemy watched the diplomatic temperature shift and understood its meaning. Massive amounts of gold bought his ancestors temporary peace, but it would certainly not buy peace with Antiochus. Brutal war was rapidly approaching, and both sovereign rulers understood this grim reality with absolute and terrifying certainty. Therefore, Ptolemy did the only thing a defending power facing overwhelmingly massive odds could realistically execute right now. He prepared to make the impending victory as expensive and logistically punishing as humanly possible for the invaders. Antiochus assumed that the notoriously decadent Egyptian royal court would immediately surrender when faced with overwhelming military force. The Egyptian chief minister, Sosibius, brilliantly exploited this exact arrogant assumption to purchase the one resource they needed. He dispatched multiple diplomatic envoys to the advancing Seleucid camp, offering generous concessions and hinting at imminent surrender. While Syrian diplomats casually debated arbitrary borderlines, the Egyptian court was quietly executing a highly radical military reform. Ptolemy faced a critical, seemingly insurmountable logistical problem that actively threatened to destroy his entire northern defensive strategy. The traditional Ptolemaic army relied almost exclusively on Greek and Macedonian settlers to form the heavily armored Phalanx. There simply were not enough Greek settlers left residing in Egypt to match the overwhelming numbers of Antiochus. He could not match the massive Seleucid numbers in an open field using conventional European military recruitment methods. Consequently, he was forced to make a brutally desperate and highly controversial decision that shattered historical political traditions. He ordered the immediate recruitment of 30,000 native Egyptian peasants to be trained as heavy Macedonian infantry. There is something almost unbearably grim about the precise political calculation that Ptolemy was making during these weeks. Every Ptolemaic commander understood perfectly that arming the oppressed native population was not a tactic anyone chose lightly. It was the strategy of a completely desperate leader who had already accepted that conventional imperial survival was impossible. For generations, the Ptolemaic dynasty maintained absolute power by keeping the native Egyptian population completely disarmed and marginalized. By actively teaching them the advanced military tactics of the Macedonian Phalanx, Ptolemy was handing them the ultimate weapon. Across the fertile Nile riverbanks, native Egyptian agricultural workers were systematically pulled from their villages into military camps. Greek drill instructors relentlessly taught these rural farmers how to properly wield the massive 20-foot wooden sarissa pikes. They learned how to march in perfect synchronization, locking their heavy bronze shields to form an impenetrable wall. Creating a professional Macedonian phalanx out of untrained farmers is an astonishing triumph of administrative and military infrastructure. It requires absolute discipline, endless repetitive drilling, and a complete psychological rewiring of the ordinary human survival instinct. Ptolemy was not simply building a defensive military force. He was fundamentally altering the social fabric of Egypt. The Macedonian phalanx was not merely a military formation. It was a highly complex and terrifyingly efficient killing machine. It required absolutely perfect synchronization from thousands of individual soldiers pressing forward as a singular and heavily armored entity. Each soldier carried a massive wooden pike called the sarissa, measuring roughly 20 feet in total lethal physical length. The first 5 rows of the massive formation lowered their heavy pikes simultaneously, creating an impenetrable wall of bronze. The rows positioned further back held their long weapons at a steep angle to effectively deflect incoming enemy projectiles. To successfully operate this highly complex formation, soldiers required incredibly intense physical conditioning and absolute, unquestioning psychological tactical discipline. Normally, only professional European mercenaries who had trained relentlessly since early childhood could execute these highly demanding tactical maneuvers. Teaching these deeply complex military movements to illiterate agricultural workers within a few short months seemed completely mathematically impossible. Yet the desperate Ptolemaic military engineers meticulously broke down the complex training process into highly repetitive and mechanical drills. They completely industrialized the entire educational process of waging war, treating the native Egyptian farmers like interchangeable machine components. This profoundly mechanical approach perfectly highlights the overarching thematic dualism dominating this incredibly brutal, ancient geopolitical and military conflict. While the Seleucid elite forces relied heavily upon their inherited cultural martial traditions, the Egyptians relied upon bureaucratic efficiency. They successfully transformed the raw, unrefined manpower of the fertile Nile Delta into a perfectly disciplined instrument of death. This administrative brilliance essentially allowed a supposedly decaying empire to rapidly generate an entirely new army from absolute nothingness. When ancient empires went to war, they did not simply send human soldiers walking blindly into a hostile territory. They deployed an entire mobile civilization, and this logistical reality becomes terrifyingly clear during the long desert marches. Moving over 100,000 heavily armored men across the barren Sinai Peninsula required an almost incomprehensible effort. Marching alongside Ptolemy's newly formed Phalanx were dedicated military surveyors constantly plotting viable supply routes in real time. Logistical officers meticulously calculated the precise water consumption rates required to keep an entire massive army functionally hydrated. Supply depots were strategically established at carefully calculated intervals before the main military column ever moved beyond borders. This is the hidden administrative aspect of ancient warfare that separates a lasting empire from a temporary raiding force. Antiochus carefully moved southward along the Levantine coast, systematically establishing supply depots to maintain his vast, heavy columns. Ptolemy marched northward from Pelusium, requiring a highly synchronized logistical network to ensure his untested army remained fed. Every single mile traversed across the scorching sand deeply tested the intricate administrative systems designed by both courts. If the essential supply wagons fell behind by just one single day, brutal dehydration would destroy everything immediately. Both empires demonstrated masterful bureaucratic precision, successfully delivering their respective war machines to the coastal plains of Raphia. The two colossal forces finally established their fortified encampments just a few miles apart, preparing for total destruction. Crossing the brutal and unforgiving Sinai Desert has historically destroyed countless ambitious armies long before they ever reached combat. The blistering summer temperatures frequently soar to completely lethal levels, severely threatening heavily armored men marching under the sun. Every single human soldier marching across this massive barren wasteland required exactly 1 gallon of fresh drinking water daily. When you multiply that fundamental biological necessity by 70,000 men, the logistical mathematics become absolutely and completely terrifying. The Ptolemaic quartermasters relentlessly organized massive caravans of heavily loaded pack camels moving continuously between the vital water sources. They successfully constructed temporary protective shading structures and strictly scheduled their longest military marches during the cooler nighttime hours. Antiochus faced identical logistical nightmares, but he possessed the distinct advantage of actively controlling the recently captured coastal settlements. His massive fleet sailed closely alongside the marching army, constantly delivering essential grain and fresh water directly from Syria. This was fundamentally a war of competing infrastructures, where quartermasters and supply chains mattered significantly more than battlefield courage. The vast desert geography was not simply a neutral staging ground. It was an incredibly hostile third combatant participating. Only highly sophisticated empires possessing immensely deep administrative capabilities could project such massive military power across this treacherous landscape. By the time both forces finally arrived near Raphia, the immense logistical strain had profoundly exhausted both military organizations. But the magnificent engineering and planning of both opposing empires successfully delivered their colossal armies to the final destination. While the human infantry desperately survived the harsh desert conditions, an entirely different kind of terror approached the battlefield. When ancient Hellenistic empires go to war, they do not simply send ordinary human soldiers with bronze swords. They deploy specialized biological siege engines designed solely to completely shatter enemy formations through sheer psychological battlefield terror. Both opposing armies fielded massive divisions of heavily armored war elephants, transforming the campaign into a logistical nightmare. Feeding dozens of colossal war elephants in a desolate desert wasteland actively stretched the absolute limits of administrative capability. Antiochus fielded a terrifying division of massive Asian elephants, heavily armored and trained for absolute battlefield destruction operations. Ptolemy countered with smaller African forest elephants, captured from the southern regions and brought north for this campaign. Let us closely zoom in on the specific mechanics of ancient elephant warfare to understand the impending disaster. Picture a massive beast nearly 10 feet tall, equipped with defensive armor, driven by a highly trained handler. Traditional Hellenistic shield wall tactics were fundamentally not designed to defend against a charging, armored biological battering ram. In the midst of a chaotic battlefield, the heavy war elephant was a precision instrument for crushing formations. However, unforgiving nature had already decided the outcome of this specific biological engagement long before the battle began. The Asian elephants deployed by Antiochus were significantly larger, heavier, and naturally more aggressive than the African species. When the two different species smelled each other across the desert winds, the psychological warfare began immediately everywhere. For Ptolemy, watching this biological mismatch unfold from the high ground, the message from nature could not be clearer. His massive biological weapons were fundamentally inferior, meaning he must rely entirely on human endurance to survive today. The ancient Indian elephants utilized by Antiochus were completely majestic beasts, frequently standing over 10 feet at the shoulder. They possessed naturally aggressive temperaments and were historically heavily accustomed to the terrifying sounds and chaotic violence of warfare. Conversely, the Ptolemaic African forest elephants were significantly smaller creatures naturally residing within the deeply isolated southern geographic regions. Modern biological science actually confirms that African forest elephants are an entirely different genetic species from massive savanna elephants. They rarely exceeded 8 feet in total height and possessed a naturally timid psychological disposition when confronting larger predators. The Egyptian handlers had desperately attempted to properly condition these highly nervous animals using loud noises and fermented wine. However, you simply cannot artificially train a biologically smaller animal to completely ignore its deeply ingrained natural survival instincts. The intense psychological pressure of the impending massive collision hung heavily over the completely silent, sun-drenched desert battlefield perfectly. The Ptolemaic leadership essentially attempted to force the highly unpredictable natural world to conform perfectly to human military geometry. Nature brutally rebelled against this arrogant mathematical assumption, resulting in the terrifying collapse of the entire Egyptian left flank. By the summer of 217 BC, after weeks of cautious maneuvering, the two colossal armies finally collided head-on. They met near the small coastal town of Raphia, the literal geographical gateway into the vulnerable Egyptian heartland. Whoever completely controlled this specific stretch of desert simultaneously controlled the direct logistical route to wealthy Alexandria itself. The brutal battle broke out beneath a blinding summer sun, thick dust rolling across the surrounding dunes quickly. It was, by every historical account, one of the most spectacular single military engagements of the entire era. The engagement began with the terrifying, earth-shattering forward charge of the war elephants on the wings of both armies. Picture a living wall of heavily armored muscle violently accelerating toward a fragile line of terrified human defenders. The psychological impact of facing a massive charging war elephant is something modern military analysis can barely adequately describe. The massive Asian elephants of Antiochus crashed violently into the smaller African elephants defending the Ptolemaic left lines. The African elephants were immediately terrified by the superior size and aggressively loud sounds of their massive counterparts. They panicked completely, turning around and crashing directly through the defensive ranks of Ptolemy's own royal cavalry guards. The ground on the left flank turned incredibly chaotic as defensive formations completely disintegrated under retreating heavy beasts. Antiochus saw the critical opening and immediately led his elite heavy cavalry in a devastating, aggressive charge forward. He successfully shattered the entire Egyptian left wing, pushing them backward and creating a massive gap in defenses. By all conventional military logic, this devastating cavalry breakthrough should have signaled the immediate end of the battle. Antiochus confidently believed he had won the war, and he recklessly pursued the fleeing Egyptian cavalry off the battlefield. This is the precise moment where arrogant improvisation collided head-on with disciplined infrastructure and carefully planned battlefield strategy. Antiochus assumed that completely destroying the enemy wing guaranteed the immediate collapse of the entire opposing command structure. He was a proud conqueror fighting for supreme glory, completely forgetting the fundamental mathematical reality of phalanx engagements. While Antiochus chased fleeting glory deep into the desert, he completely abandoned his main infantry phalanx behind him. He left his deeply experienced central infantry formations standing essentially blind and entirely unsupported in the shifting desert dust. With the left wing completely shattered, the military situation for the Ptolemaic army seemed poised to unravel completely. Word rapidly reached Ptolemy's central headquarters that the flank was burning and his royal guards were retreating quickly. Most ancient commanders stationed in the rear would desperately scramble to organize any kind of coherent tactical retreat. Ptolemy did not panic. Instead, he calculated the exact mathematical advantage he still held in the battlefield center. He rode directly to the front lines of his central phalanx, making himself completely visible to his soldiers. He placed his ultimate survival directly into the hands of the 30,000 native Egyptian peasants he trained. Seeing their monarch personally standing alongside them permanently ignited a furious surge of nationalistic pride among the Egyptians. The center of the massive battlefield was completely dominated by two incredibly dense blocks of heavily armed infantrymen. The veteran Seleucid phalanx confidently advanced forward, expecting to effortlessly crush the notoriously weak Greek soldiers of the Egyptians. They assumed these native farmers possessed absolutely no military discipline and would collapse upon experiencing real battlefield violence. The two massive phalanx formations finally engaged, a brutal grinding match of thousands of 20-foot wooden spear points. There was no dramatic single act of heroism here, no rousing theatrical speech before a glorious infantry charge. What actually unfolded on this dusty field was something colder, more clinical, and frankly more terrifying in efficiency. Disciplined Egyptian infantry formed tight, unbroken defensive lines, massive spears leveled in unison, absorbing the immense forward physical pressure. This phase of ancient warfare, known historically as the Othismos, is a horrific, claustrophobic nightmare of human endurance. Men are pressed tightly together, utilizing the heavy bronze shields strapped to their shoulders to physically shove backward. It is a brutal contest of mechanical pressure, requiring unimaginable collective stamina and absolute trust in your comrades. The native Egyptians absorbed the immense physical shock of the collision, anchoring their heavy boots into the sand. They were fighting not just for a foreign Greek king, but to definitively prove their own lethal capability. Because Antiochus was missing from the battlefield, the Seleucid center lacked the decisive leadership needed to maintain morale. The Egyptian native Phalanx methodically pushed forward, their sheer massive numbers and disciplined training overwhelming the veteran infantry. The engagement was decided by a series of small, almost invisible tactical advantages, stacking aggressively upon each other. Slightly better hydration, slightly more desperate motivation, slightly more disciplined formation holding under the massive external physical pressure. The native Egyptian warriors systematically tore openings into the Seleucid formations that by conventional military logic seemed impossible. Formation cohesion slowly collapsed within the Seleucid ranks as they realized their emperor was nowhere to be found. The carefully constructed Seleucid center began to break apart under the sustained, relentless pressure from the Egyptian natives. The supposedly invincible Seleucid professional center began to fracture, buckle, and ultimately collapse under the relentless Egyptian momentum. The once mighty Seleucid phalanx ultimately shattered, abandoning their heavy equipment as they fled desperately toward the north. By the time Antiochus finally returned from his reckless pursuit, he discovered that his magnificent army had vanished. His boldest, riskiest gamble of the entire war ended in total defeat because he arrogantly ignored his infantry. With his central fighting capacity completely destroyed, Antiochus had absolutely nothing meaningful left to continue the aggressive campaign. He was forced to immediately order a humiliating retreat, abandoning Coelesyria and returning in total defeat toward Antioch. Ptolemy had successfully defended his wealthy kingdom, temporarily securing his borders and preserving the immense wealth of Egypt. The immediate aftermath of the horrific battle at Raphia presented an absolutely gruesome and deeply traumatizing visual historical spectacle. More than 10,000 highly trained Seleucid infantrymen lay dead beneath the scorching and entirely unforgiving summer desert sun. Thousands more were aggressively captured by the advancing Egyptian forces and permanently forced into deeply humiliating and brutal slavery. Antiochus essentially lost the entire professional veteran corps of his incredibly magnificent and massively expensive Imperial Asian military machine. The Ptolemaic casualties were remarkably lighter, but they still suffered the deeply painful loss of several thousand brave soldiers. The massive bodies of dozens of dead and dying war elephants littered the blood-stained battlefield like violently fallen mountains. Specialized Egyptian medical units frantically scrambled across the incredibly chaotic terrain, desperately attempting to bandage heavily bleeding native soldiers. This was not the clean, romantically lopsided massacre that highly arrogant imperial conquerors typically expect when crushing regional kingdoms. The supposedly weak and hopelessly decadent Egyptian kingdom had bitten back with an unimaginably brutal and highly devastating ferocity. The vast dunes of the Levantine coast were heavily soaked in the precious blood of two incredibly powerful empires. The incredibly shocking scale of the Seleucid defeat sent massive geopolitical tremors echoing across the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Nobody had truly believed that a hastily assembled army of native farmers could successfully shatter an elite Macedonian phalanx. So why exactly does this monumental story of ancient warfare conclude in such a remarkably unexpected and asymmetrical manner? Because tactical brilliance and raw aggressive momentum mean absolutely nothing if a military commander lacks total comprehensive situational awareness. Rome didn't simply outfight their enemies on the battlefield, they systematically outbuilt them at every single stage of campaigning. Similarly, Egypt won this magnificent victory because they recognized their own fatal weaknesses and systematically engineered a specialized countermeasure. They successfully replaced individual combat heroism with relentless bureaucratic efficiency, transforming a severe national vulnerability into an unbreakable weapon. Antiochus allowed his deeply intoxicating personal ambition for glorious combat to completely blind him to the actual battlefield mechanics. He relied entirely upon inherited imperial prejudices, arrogantly assuming that native troops could never withstand the pressure of professionals. Antiochus desperately needed his aggressive cavalry momentum to completely shatter the enemy before his own unsupported center inevitably collapsed. Ptolemy essentially treated the rigid and sacred structure of his own ancient society as a disposable and reshapeable tool. He constructed an entirely new phantom army explicitly designed to perfectly counter the single greatest tactical strength of Antiochus. The Egyptian administrative machine successfully absorbed a massive initial shock and effectively adapted to neutralize the invading Seleucid forces. Back in Alexandria, this monumental victory was celebrated aggressively as a major triumph of Ptolemaic strategic brilliance and power. The brutal war had successfully broken Seleucid momentum, forced their retreat, and secured Egyptian independence for several decades. But here is the profoundly dark part that most conventional historical retellings leave out entirely when discussing Raphia. The legendary victory achieved at Raphia was not actually a permanent salvation for the wealthy Ptolemaic royal dynasty. It functioned instead as a temporary pause, a socio-political trap constructed out of time and terrible unintended consequences. Because in total warfare waged at an imperial scale, desperate survival tactics often plant the seeds of destruction. Ptolemy did not simply outfight Antiochus on the battlefield. He systematically empowered the very people his dynasty historically oppressed. The 30,000 native Egyptians who held the line at Raphia returned home with intense military combat experience. They realized a profound and highly dangerous truth that no amount of royal propaganda could ever erase completely. They were the ones who actually saved the empire, and they no longer needed to submit to foreigners. They realized that the arrogant Greek ruling class was absolutely dependent upon native Egyptian blood to survive external threats. By directly distributing standardized military weaponry to the subjugated native farmers, Ptolemy essentially shattered his own royal political monopoly. The native Egyptians had marched into the blistering desert as heavily oppressed subjects, but they returned as hardened veterans. Within just a few short years of this magnificent victory, the internal political pressure finally reached absolute critical mass. The very same native soldiers who miraculously saved the Ptolemaic Kingdom at Raphia turned their deadly pikes against Alexandria. They furiously ignited the Great Theban Revolt, a massive and devastating civil war that would permanently cripple the dynasty. The southern region of Upper Egypt completely broke away from Ptolemaic control. establishing an independent native pharaoh in Thebes. This incredibly brutal internal conflict would continuously drain the economic resources of Egypt for over 2 terribly bloody decades. The Egyptian dynasty was brutally forced to constantly fight highly exhausting internal wars against the very people they armed. In their desperate attempt to survive a foreign invasion, the Ptolemies meticulously engineered the exact instruments of their destruction. A kingdom fighting desperately for its own immediate survival created an internal military force that eventually threatened its existence. That, fundamentally, is the core historical lesson buried deeply inside the tactical masterpiece of the incredible Battle of Raphia. This isn't simply a thrilling story of overwhelming underdog strength successfully crushing an arrogant imperial army in the desert. It is a profound warning that arming the oppressed to aggressively save the crown eventually guarantees that crown's destruction. Decebalus and Trajan fought bitterly over terrain and engineering, but Ptolemy and Antiochus fought over the manipulation of society. Antiochus needed his tactical aggressive momentum to work perfectly, indefinitely, against an opponent who eventually absorbed his initial shock. Ptolemy temporarily solved the problem of the massive invasion, but in doing so he unleashed a permanently irreversible revolution. The Hellenistic world would never look the same again, and the bloody sands of Raphia claimed Egyptian innocence. Tools aggressively created for mass violence rarely return peacefully to the quiet storage boxes once the immediate conflict concludes. Raphia wasn't just a magnificent ancient battle. It was a deeply dangerous historical transaction where survival was purchased dearly. The glorious Ptolemaic victory at Raphia essentially functioned as a magnificent gilded trap, actively initiating their slow, painful death. If you enjoyed this deep breakdown of ancient wars, tactical masterclasses, and brutal historical decisions, please subscribe today. Thanks for watching our documentary channel, and we will absolutely see you in the next ancient military history dive.